While a millionaire drowns in silence after losing his wife, a maid named Monica is quietly saving his baby from fading away. One desperate moment, one forbidden gesture. She gives the child something no one else could: life. But when he catches her in the act, what begins as outrage sparks a chain of confessions, losses, and second chances. And just when healing seems impossible, a 6-year-old girl says one word that rewrites everything. Stay with us until the end, because in this house, family isn't made by blood. It's chosen in silence. Grace wouldn't stop crying. For hours now, her tiny body had writhed and stiffened against every effort to comfort her. Monica Harris, alone in the nursery after the nanny's abrupt departure, had tried everything she could think of: rocking, pacing, even humming that old gospel lullaby her mother used to sing when Monica herself was sick. Nothing worked. The formula bottle sat untouched on the dresser, cold now, just like the one before it. Grace turned her face each time it approached her lips, rejecting it with a frail cry, her fists trembling weakly in the air. Monica felt her heart clench tighter with every passing minute. She had held many babies before, changed diapers for years, raised her own daughter through the hardest days of single motherhood. But this felt different. This was watching a child teeter on the edge of something irreversible. She could see it in the baby's eyes, barely open now, her cries quieter, hoarser. The room didn't need to echo to feel unbearable. Grace was fading right there in her arms, and Monica's body began to respond in a way she hadn't expected. A soreness in her chest, a familiar pressure. She froze, breath caught in her throat. Her milk, it had come back. She didn't move for a full minute, stunned by the realization. It had been over 2 months since she'd last nursed Lena. She remembered the final time vividly, the way Lena had curled into her and then pulled away, a little older, a little more independent. Monica had cried that night in the bathroom, alone, as her body adjusted to the absence. But it hadn't fully stopped. Her breasts had ached randomly since then, but she hadn't thought much of it, chalking it up to hormones, stress, the strain of working long hours while still trying to be present for her daughter. Now it was undeniable. Something in Grace's desperate hunger had triggered her body's instinct to nourish again. She looked down at the baby, whose mouth opened and closed with reflexive motions, too weak now to cry with full force. Monica's heart raced. This wasn't her child. This wasn't her right. What would Mr. Lawson say? What would anyone say? But Grace didn't have time for bureaucracy or guilt. Monica wasn't thinking as a maid anymore. She was thinking as a mother, a woman who knew what it was to nearly lose a child and live with that ache. Her hands moved slowly, trembling as they reached for the buttons on her uniform. She could hardly believe what she was doing, but something deeper than logic guided her. Maybe love, maybe mercy. The moment Grace's lips brushed her skin, something shifted. The baby latched immediately, instinctively, as if she'd been waiting for this very answer all along. Monica gasped, not from pain, but from relief. She could feel the baby drawing strength with every pull, her tiny fists softening, her whole body easing as if the chaos inside her had finally found peace. Monica held her tightly, one hand behind the baby's damp curls, the other cupping her back. The sensation was more than physical. It was like the edges of Monica's soul, frayed and fragile for so long, were being stitched together by this one act. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them, spilling silently down her cheeks. She hadn't cried in front of anyone in years, hadn't allowed herself to be vulnerable this way. But in this moment, it wasn't about shame or rules or consequences. Grace was feeding. She was breathing easier. That was all that mattered. Monica lowered her forehead gently against the baby's and whispered, "That's it, sweet girl, eat, just eat." She didn't realize how tight her own chest had felt until it finally loosened, not just from the release of milk, but from the unbearable tension of watching a baby suffer without being able to help. Monica didn't know how long they stayed like that. Time blurred, lost between heartbeats and the soft rhythm of Grace nursing. Everything else fell away. She thought of Lena, how small she had once been, how Monica had sworn to protect her no matter what. How many nights they had both gone to bed hungry because Monica refused to compromise her dignity for help. And now, here she was, feeding another man's child, breaking a rule that wasn't written down but had been imprinted in the silence between classes, races, roles. But what kind of mother, what kind of human could watch a child suffer and do nothing? She hadn't meant for it to happen like this, but now that it had, she couldn't deny what had taken place. Grace had accepted her. Her body had responded. There was no going back to pretending she was just the maid. Not now. Not after this. She brushed the baby's cheek with her knuckle, marveling at how peaceful she looked, how her little chest rose and fell so softly now. Monica breathed with her, matching the rhythm, grounding herself in that quiet miracle. She felt no pride, no triumph, only a trembling sort of stillness. This wasn't a victory. It was a rescue, a stolen moment of safety in a world where children are too often left to fend for themselves. Monica knew what this meant. She knew the risks, the assumptions people might make. It didn't matter. She could feel Grace's heartbeat against her skin. She could feel her own pulse slow. There was a rhythm now, a balance. Her own grief, still buried under years of holding everything together, began to stir. Beneath the surface. Maybe that's what this was really about. Not just Grace, not just hunger, but the grief Monica never had time to feel, now speaking to her through this borrowed child. She let her eyes close for a second. Just 1 second. And in that second, something inside her settled. She didn't want thanks. She didn't need approval. She just needed Grace to be okay, just needed this child, even if not hers, to feel safe, if only for a little while longer. And then, silence. Not the cold, suffocating kind that had filled the mansion before, but the sacred, full silence of peace. Grace had fallen asleep against her, mouth slightly open, a drop of milk resting on her lip. Monica didn't move. She simply stared at the child in her arms, stunned by the stillness, by the absence of pain. It was over, for now. The desperation, the panic, the helplessness, all quieted. Monica shifted slightly and pulled the edge of her sweater up to cover herself, moving carefully so as not to wake the baby. Her body ached, but her heart felt oddly light. A secret now lived between them, a bond, a beginning. She kissed the baby's forehead gently, barely a brush of skin. "Your mama's not here," she whispered, "but I am." She didn't say more, there was no need. The silence said enough. Richard Lawson wasn't supposed to be home until late that evening. His calendar had been booked with back-to-back meetings in Atlanta, but somewhere between his second untouched cup of coffee and the crushing silence of yet another business lunch, he'd had enough. The grief had followed him like a shadow through every handshake and slide deck. It wasn't about being busy anymore. It was about escape. But even that wasn't working. He needed to come home, though he hadn't realized he'd walked into the eye of something far more personal than a boardroom storm. He took the stairs 2 at a time, not knowing what he was looking for, only knowing that the silence felt different, not empty, not anxious, just different. And then he saw it. At the threshold of the nursery, the door slightly ajar, he froze. Inside, Monica Harris sat on the rocking chair, his daughter nestled at her breast. And next to her, a small girl, 6, maybe 7, played with one of Grace's plush toys on the floor, humming quietly to herself. For a beat, Richard could not breathe. The image struck him like a slap, like betrayal woven into domestic tenderness. Then heat surged through him, unforgiving and instant. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard's voice boomed into the room before he even registered how tightly his fists had clenched at his sides. Monica jumped, startled but not panicked, her arms tightening instinctively around Grace. Her eyes met his, steady but tired, and for a moment, that calm only infuriated him more. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he continued, stepping into the room now, glaring at the woman he thought he could trust. "You think you can just... what? Pretend you're her mother?" His words cut sharp, designed to wound, to shame. The little girl on the floor, Lena, looked up, confused but silent, sensing the danger. Monica didn't flinch, but her jaw tensed, her voice shaking slightly as she replied, "She wasn't eating, Mr. Lawson. She refused the bottle for days. She was getting weaker." He scoffed, almost laughed, cold and bitter. "So you thought breastfeeding her was the answer, without asking me?" Monica's arms didn't move, but her gaze hardened. There wasn't time to ask. She needed milk. She needed something. Her voice cracked, just barely, but it was enough to splinter his fury. Not break it, but rattle it. Richard turned his eyes to Grace, peaceful, full, asleep. That only deepened the contradiction burning in his chest. She looked better, stronger. It made him feel worse. "And the child?" he snapped, gesturing toward Lena. "Who even is?" "My daughter," Monica interrupted firmly. "Her name is Lena. She stays with me after school. Because I can't afford full-time care. She's quiet. She doesn't touch anything." Richard opened his mouth again, but nothing coherent came out. Too many things tangled at once. The boundaries he believed were being crossed, the questions of professionalism, propriety, control, but none of it could explain the way Grace's fingers rested gently against Monica's blouse, or the way that small girl, Lena, looked at his daughter with such simple, innocent concern. "You hid this from me," he muttered, almost to himself, like someone stating the obvious and hating the sound of it. "You hid this from me." Monica's expression shifted then, not to guilt, but something more complex. "Because I knew what it would look like to you, and I knew you wouldn't see what mattered most." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful like the one that had filled the room before. This one was tense, sharp-edged, filled with unsaid things clawing to be heard. Richard didn't know what to do with it. For a man used to controlling outcomes, this kind of vulnerability felt like walking into a room full of broken glass barefoot. "You think I don't care about my daughter?" he asked, the question more defensive than sincere. Monica didn't answer right away. Her hands moved to adjust Grace's blanket as she whispered, "I think you're grieving. I think you don't know how to hold her without falling apart." That landed like a stone in his chest. His shoulders tightened. He hated that she was right. He hated more that she saw it. "Don't psychoanalyze me," he snapped, voice lower now but no less sharp. Monica met his glare without blinking. "I'm not," she said. "I'm just telling you what I see. A man who hasn't held his baby since the funeral. A baby who's been starving for warmth, not just food. And a mother who saw that and couldn't walk away. That word, mother, hung in the air like smoke. It didn't belong to her, not in this house, and yet she'd earned it in a way that shamed him." Lena rose from the floor, clutching the stuffed animal to her chest, and walked slowly to Monica's side. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply leaned against her mother's leg, a quiet gesture that said everything Richard couldn't understand. Monica ran her fingers through her daughter's curls, absent-mindedly, eyes still on him. "If you want me gone, say so," she said, voice steady now. "But don't twist what happened here. Your daughter needed something no one else could give her. I didn't do this for me, I did it for her." The challenge in her words wasn't defiant, it was honest, raw. Richard didn't answer. Not yet. Because despite the fire still simmering in his chest, despite everything he Thought he knew about boundaries and roles. Something inside him had shifted, not enough to admit out loud, not enough to soften visibly, but the crack was there. Monica could see it, and so could he. And as he turned sharply without another word and left the room, the scene remained exactly as he had found it, Monica holding Grace, Lena beside them, a tableau that despite his anger he couldn't unsee. The silence he left behind wasn't hollow. It was pregnant with uncertainty, with unfinished thoughts, with the first rattle of a wall beginning to fracture. The woman he had just accused sat, still, trembling slightly but anchored, and for the second time that day, in a house once ruled by sorrow, the silence spoke louder than anything he could bring himself to say. Lena stood on the cushioned window seat of the nursery, her small finger drawing letters onto the fogged glass with quiet concentration. Monica had only stepped away for a moment to fold the laundry at the foot of Grace's crib, but something about the stillness drew her gaze back toward her. Her daughter. Lena didn't know she was being watched, and that made the moment all the more tender. The window had fogged from the warmth of the nursery, and in that soft blur she carefully etched two large letters, LG. Monica paused. At first, she thought it was just a game, a child doodling as children do, but the truth sank in like a slow tide. LG, Lena and Grace, side by side, initials twinned in the glass like a secret pact. Monica felt something stir inside her chest, equal parts awe and panic. There was no way Lena could understand the weight of what she was doing, but Monica did. In that simple gesture, her daughter had declared a bond, a belonging, one that crossed bloodlines and last names. And as Monica watched, the guilt of what she had done wrestled against the growing tenderness that rooted itself deeper each passing hour she spent in this house. Monica had not spoken, not to Richard since that tense confrontation the day before. She hadn't dared to ask whether she still had a job. The silence that followed his retreat from the nursery had been neither approval nor condemnation. It was just space, and that space had grown heavier with each passing hour. She kept expecting someone from the agency to call or for Richard himself to appear with some legal reprimand, but nothing came. So she kept working, kept feeding Grace when needed, kept pretending the clock hadn't stopped ticking on her employment. But seeing Lena draw those letters now, so innocently, so full of unspoken love, made her feel both exposed and deeply moved. She wanted to pull her daughter down gently, tell her to stop before someone saw, before Richard misunderstood again. But she couldn't, because for all the uncertainty clouding Monica's world, Lena's heart was clear, clear enough to see Grace as family, and in that there was something beautiful, dangerous perhaps, but beautiful. Monica crossed the room slowly, not to stop her, but simply to be closer, as if standing beside her daughter might anchor her to something steadier than her own shaking resolve. Lena looked up at her, beaming with a kind of joy Monica hadn't seen since they left their old apartment behind, when money was tight, but days were full of games on the floor and silly songs before bed. "Look, Mama," she said proudly, pointing to the letters. "LG, like superheroes, Lena and Grace." Monica smiled, but it came slower than usual, shaped more by emotion than reflex. She crouched beside her daughter and touched the glass gently, just above the little swirl Lena had added as a flourish under the initials. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said softly. "You really like being here with Grace, don't you?" Lena nodded quickly. "She's so small, but she likes me. She smiles when I bring her bunny." Monica reached over and brushed a strand of hair from Lena's cheek, heart aching with both gratitude and fear. Gratitude for this innocent affection that her daughter gave so freely. Fear that it could all be ripped away with one word from the man who owned the house. "Just maybe don't write on the window again, okay?" Monica added gently. "It's hard to clean." Lena nodded, unbothered. "Okay, but she knows." I told her already. She's my Grace. Monica swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She didn't know how to hold that truth in her chest without breaking. Richard had come upstairs quietly, unnoticed, holding a file folder he never made it to open. He had meant only to check in, to convince himself that the peace in the house wasn't temporary. But as he approached the nursery, voices filtered. Through the cracked door, he stopped. Something in Lena's tone held him there, not just the softness but the familiarity in it. He leaned forward, just enough to see what they couldn't see of him. There was Monica, crouched beside her daughter, watching as the little girl pointed proudly to a glass. LG, he read silently. He didn't move. He just stood there, file forgotten, something flickering quietly behind his eyes. Lena and Grace. The letters should have disturbed him, like someone claiming what wasn't theirs. But they didn't. They felt right. Or maybe not right exactly, but needed. For so long, the nursery had felt like a shrine to absence, a room preserved for a child who cried through silence and woke up to strangers. But now it had drawings in the windows, bunny toys in the crib, laughter, a child playing, another being held. He wasn't ready to admit it, but it felt like the house had taken a breath, a small one, but real. He stepped back before either of them saw him, still uncertain of what he would say if he walked in. He hadn't forgiven Monica. He hadn't made any decision about what came next. But for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own home. He carried that thought back down the hallway, turning it over in his mind like a coin in his palm. He still had questions. He still carried hurt. But what he had seen, that quiet moment of belonging, planted something in him that refused to be ignored. He told himself, over and over, that he didn't need help. That control was safety. That distance was survival. But Lena had written something on the glass that couldn't be unwritten. Something pure, something uninvited. And somehow, it had reached him. Back in the nursery, Monica rose and gently lifted Lena down from the window seat. She reached for a tissue and wiped the initials off the glass with slow, deliberate movements, as if erasing a truth she didn't yet have the right to preserve. Lena frowned. "Why'd you take it away?" she asked. Monica kissed the top of her daughter's head and gave her a soft smile. "Some things we keep here," she said, pressing a hand over Lena's chest, "not always on the window." Lena didn't fully understand, but she nodded, settling next to the crib where Grace slept soundly. Monica turned back to the window for a moment. The fog was clearing. The letters were gone. But the warmth they had brought lingered. What Monica didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Richard had seen, that he had stopped, and that for the very first time since his wife's passing, he hadn't walked past the nursery in pain, but paused there in something else. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. For weeks, sleep had come to Richard in thin, unreliable doses, never restful, never without interruption. Grace's crying had carved itself into his body, waking him before she did, pulling him into consciousness with phantom echoes, even on the rare nights she had gone silent. But this night was different. He awoke not to her cries, but to stillness. Disoriented, he sat up in bed and looked toward the clock on the wall. 3:16 a.m. He had gone to bed just before 10. That meant nearly 5 hours. His heart jumped, not from relief but panic. He threw the sheets off and rushed barefoot down. The hallway, the old anxiety kicking in, the kind that never left once you became a parent. Something was wrong. It had to be. Grace never slept that long. He pushed the nursery door open, not even trying to be gentle, his breath catching in his throat, with the possibilities racing through his mind. But what he found inside made him freeze, not out of fear this time, but something else entirely. The room was dim, but his eyes adjusted quickly. The crib was empty. His gaze moved lower, to the floor, where Monica lay curled on her side, one arm draped protectively over Grace, the baby nestled in the crook of her body. On Monica's other side, Lena slept as well, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, small fingers loosely clutching the hem of Monica's shirt. The three of them were wrapped in an unintentional embrace, like a single breath shared between three hearts. Richard stood frozen for several moments, his chest rising and falling too fast. His brain kept trying to find the offense in it, the breach of protocol, the reason to speak up. But his heart couldn't deny the peace in the room. It was the first time he had seen Grace sleep that deeply since her mother had died. The soft rise and fall of her body was steady, secure. He stepped forward, instinctively quieter now, as if afraid to disrupt whatever fragile miracle had unfolded while he slept. He knelt slowly beside them, one knee popping softly, ignored entirely. He could see that Monica was fully dressed, her apron rumpled, hair loose at the edges. Her exhaustion was written plainly across her face, even in sleep. It wasn't the exhaustion of a shift worked too long, it was the exhaustion of care, the kind that came from emptying yourself entirely into someone else. Lena, breathing softly, had pressed her face into the blanket beneath them, completely unaware of how foreign she looked in that room, and yet how right she felt in it. Richard swallowed hard. There was something happening in this house, and he hadn't been able to name it until now. It wasn't just about rules or positions or who was employed to do what. There was love growing here, quiet, patient, undeserved, and he had almost missed it, almost dismissed it. Still kneeling, unsure of what compelled him, he reached for the folded blanket draped over the back of the rocking chair. His hands moved with a tenderness he didn't understand. Slowly, he unfolded the blanket and draped it gently over Monica's back, then over Lena's small legs. Grace shifted slightly but didn't wake. Richard's breath caught at the tiny sound she made. A small sigh, not a cry. It had been so long since that was all he'd heard from her. He stood, again pulling the blanket across their sleeping bodies until all three were covered. The gesture wasn't planned. It wasn't performative. It simply happened. It was the kind of movement that came from a place deeper than thought, deeper than guilt or duty. It came from watching your daughter sleep, for the first time without distress, and realizing someone else had done what you had not been able to. He should have felt shame, and maybe part of him did. But more than that, he felt something cracking, not painfully, but slowly, a thawing he hadn't invited but couldn't stop. He stood there for a long while, just watching. He didn't speak. He didn't leave right away. He simply let the silence wash over him, this new kind of silence. Calm, sacred, whole. His wife had once said that babies knew who loved them, that they could feel it in the way arms held them, in the softness of a voice. He hadn't remembered that until now, but watching Grace pressed into Monica's chest, peaceful and safe, he wondered if his daughter had known something before he did. He wondered what his wife would say if she saw this unspoken reshaping of what a family could look like when everything you planned had shattered. And for once, the question didn't come with bitterness. It came with a quiet kind of curiosity. He tucked the corner of the blanket a little more securely beneath Lena's ankle, then turned to leave the room, his steps light, his breathing softer, as Richard pulled the door to a gentle. Close behind him, he paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't understand why he had done what he'd just done. He couldn't explain the instinct to protect, not just Grace, but Monica and Lena too. But it didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel like something to question. It felt human, and that was, and more than he'd felt in a long time. In the quiet hallway he stood alone, the image of the three of them imprinted behind his eyes, refusing to fade. Something had changed. Not enough to say out loud, not enough to act on yet, But something inside him was no longer sealed shut, and as he walked back to his room, the house behind him held, for the first time in months, a different kind of silence. A silence without crying, a silence full of breath and life, and something just beginning to bloom. Monica sat rigidly in the leather chair across from Richard's desk, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She hadn't been summoned. No one had sent for her. She had knocked softly, because the weight of what lingered between them had become too heavy to carry in. Silence. Richard hadn't looked up right away when she entered, just gestured with a flick of his hand that she should sit. That alone had made her chest tighten, because if he didn't even have the strength to argue, it meant he might already have made up his mind. She watched him now, behind the desk, the same man whose fury had once echoed in this very room. But something was different. His jaw was still tight, yes, but there was something in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his fingers drummed once against the wood and stopped. She knew she had only one chance to speak truth, and so, with a breath steadier than she felt, she began. "You asked why I did it," she said softly. "Why I fed your daughter like that. And I need you to understand, I wasn't trying to take anything from you." Richard's gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers with eyes that didn't burn with anger anymore, but with something far more vulnerable. He didn't interrupt her. That alone startled her enough to pause, but she pressed forward. "When I had Lena, I nearly died in that hospital. Complications, hemorrhage. She came early. I was alone, terrified, and no one would tell me if she would make it. I remember begging one of the nurses, 'Please just tell me if she's breathing.' Her voice cracked then, and she had to close her eyes for a moment. After we got home, she struggled to latch. She cried for hours. I stayed awake for nights, trying. When she finally latched, I thought, okay, she's going to live. That's what it meant to me, not feeding, living." Richard leaned back in his chair, his hand rising slightly and then falling again, like he wanted to reach for something but didn't know what. Monica continued, voice quieter now. "So when I saw Grace starving, rejecting the bottle, I panicked. My milk had never fully dried up, and something inside me said, 'Don't let this baby die like yours almost did.'" There was silence then. Not awkward, not accusatory, just silence that held space for grief. Monica inhaled deeply, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I didn't do it to cross a line," she said. "I didn't do it to pretend she was mine. I did it because I know what it feels like to hold a baby who's fading, and I couldn't watch that again, not when I could help." Richard didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked down at his own hands, resting on the desk like they didn't belong to him. "I haven't held her," he said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Monica blinked. "What?" He swallowed. "Since the funeral. Since they handed her to me at the cemetery and then took her away again, I haven't held her more than 5 minutes. I thought if I touched her too long, I'd feel—" He stopped, the sentence fracturing mid-thought. "I'd feel how much she looks like her mother." His voice broke then, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that Monica recognized it for what it was. The sound of a man standing at the edge of grief for the first time. Without running from it, Monica didn't interrupt him. She didn't tell him it was okay or offer him comfort. She simply let the truth hang there with dignity, unpolished and real. "That kind of loss," she said gently, "rewires everything. I know. You think that if you feel again, you'll fall apart." Richard nodded once, slowly, his eyes glistening with a sheen of tears he hadn't wiped away. "I've been hiding," he admitted, "from Grace, from everything. I just kept working. It was easier. I thought if I didn't slow down, I wouldn't have to feel any of it." Monica shifted in her seat, her voice steady now. But she feels it. Babies do. They know when they're alone, even if they don't have words for it. She wasn't just hungry, Mr. Lawson. She was grieving too. For a moment, both of them sat there, no longer maid and employer, not even mother and father, just two broken people holding the sharp ends of love and loss between them, trying not to bleed on each other. A tear slipped down Monica's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Richard's eyes remained on the corner of the desk, unfocused, wet with emotion he hadn't given permission to surface. Another silence settled. This one, softer, more sacred. "She loves you, you know," Monica said at last, barely audible. "When you come into the room, she turns her head. Even if you don't notice, she does." Richard nodded slowly. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" he asked. Monica blinked hard, holding back a sob. "She already has," she replied. "All she wants is for you to hold her." They didn't touch. They didn't cross the line that would turn this exchange into comfort. They just sat there, facing the same pain from opposite sides of the same wound, and for the first time, letting it bleed between them honestly. They cried, quietly, separately together, not in each other's arms, not even reaching across the space between them, but side by side, like two people who had finally stopped running. When Monica rose to leave, Richard didn't stop her. He didn't thank her either. He simply nodded once, a gesture that carried more than any apology could have. Monica opened the door without a word and stepped into the hallway, the echo of what was finally said still vibrating in her chest. Inside the office, Richard remained in his chair, tears drying on his cheeks. For the first time, they had both spoken the things that had nearly broken them, and in the act of saying them, something heavy had lifted. The grief hadn't gone, but it had been seen, and for now, that was enough. Lena was supposed to be playing in the corner room, the one Monica always told her to stay in when she needed to work nearby. But curiosity had gotten the better of her, as it often did in a house filled with secrets and stairs and doors that creaked with stories. She had wandered into the attic, not to disobey but to explore. Monica would have called her back immediately if she'd known, but Lena moved quietly, her tiny footsteps muffled by dust and memory. In the far corner of the attic, beneath an old cedar chest, Lena found something folded neatly, pressed flat between years of silence and sunlight. A quilt. It wasn't like the blankets she used at home. This one was heavy, colorful, hand-stitched in soft patterns and fading thread. It smelled like lavender and something else she couldn't name. She didn't know it had been made by Richard's late wife during her final pregnancy, her fingers sewing late into the night with Grace's future in mind. Lena only saw something soft and beautiful, something a baby might like. So she gathered it in both arms, dragging it carefully down the stairs like it was treasure, determined to bring it to Grace. In the nursery, Monica was in the middle of changing Grace's diaper when Lena appeared, holding the quilt like a sacred offering. "I found this upstairs," she said proudly. "It looks like it's for her." Monica looked up, alarm flickering across her face at first. "Sweetheart, you can't go in the attic," she said, trying to keep her voice even, not wanting to crush the joy in her daughter's expression. "I know," Lena replied, eyes wide and hopeful. "But I saw it, and it felt like it was waiting for her." Monica paused, then knelt down to examine it. Her fingers traced the stitching. It was delicate, intentional, far too impersonal to have been made by anyone but someone who had loved deeply. She knew immediately what it was. She remembered the housekeeper mentioning once that Richard's wife used to sew, that she'd made a quilt before she passed. Monica's breath caught. It felt like holding a memory. She should have returned it immediately, but when she looked at Lena's face, earnest, open, she hesitated. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's put it in her crib, but carefully, all right?" Lena beamed, nodding. She smoothed the quilt over Grace's mattress with both hands, gently pressing it down like she was tucking love into each corner. Richard entered the room only minutes later, looking for a report he thought he'd left on the dresser. He barely glanced up until something unfamiliar caught his eye. The colors, the stitching, the quilt. His heart jolted. He took a step closer, and there it was. The patchwork. Fabric Claire had spent weeks working on, her belly round with Grace inside her hands moving as if the future depended on each stitch. It had disappeared after the funeral. He had assumed someone had packed it away to spare him the pain. But now, there it was, spread out in Grace's crib, looking like it belonged. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice tighter than intended. Lena, still standing proudly by the crib, answered without hesitation. "I found it upstairs. It looked like it was hers." His first instinct was to pull it out, fold it up, put it back in whatever box it had come from. But he looked at Lena, so sincere, so unaware of the weight that quilt carried, and the urge dissolved. Instead, he reached down, picked up the edge of the blanket, and began to straighten it with careful hands. No one told him to. No one asked. It was simply something that needed doing. His fingers moved slower than usual, tugging each corner into place, smoothing wrinkles like he was touching time itself. Every square of that quilt held a memory he hadn't been ready to face. But now, with Grace sleeping peacefully under it, and Lena watching him with quiet curiosity, he didn't pull away. Monica stood at the doorway, saying nothing. She hadn't meant to witness this. She had just come back from putting away laundry, intending to call Lena for dinner. But when she saw Richard's hands lingering on that quilt, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just that he hadn't rejected the gesture. It was how gentle he had become in the presence of it. She didn't speak. She didn't make herself known. She just stood there, her heart too full to move. There was something deeply sacred about a man allowing himself to touch pain without shielding it in anger. Monica hadn't seen this version of him before, not at the funeral, not during their late-night talks in the kitchen when he couldn't sleep. But she saw it now. She knew he didn't realize she was there, and she didn't need him to. This wasn't about acknowledgement or validation. It was about watching someone begin to return to themselves after too long spent hidden behind grief. Monica's eyes burned with tears she didn't let fall. Instead, she focused on the way Richard adjusted the last corner of the quilt, then stepped back slightly, his hands still hovering for a moment before he let them fall to his sides. Lena turned to him. "She likes it," she said, looking down at Grace. Richard didn't answer right away. He just nodded once and murmured, "She should." Then he turned to leave, still not seeing Monica standing at the door. But before he disappeared down the hallway, something in his face had softened. Not completely, not enough to erase the past, but enough to suggest he was no longer clinging to it as tightly. Monica remained in place, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, her eyes still on the crib. Grace slept soundly beneath the quilt, her tiny fist resting on one of the embroidered squares. Lena had already skipped off, humming to herself, unaware of the gravity she had just shifted with one innocent choice. Monica didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply smiled. Not broadly, not in triumph. Just a small, honest smile, the kind that slips out when something painful and beautiful happens at the same time. And as she turned to head back to her chores, she carried that smile with her, quiet and full, like a secret she didn't need to say aloud. The garden lunch was never meant to be anything more than a moment of quiet. Richard had suggested it offhandedly that morning, surprising even himself. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He just didn't want to eat alone inside anymore. The sun was gentle, the food simple. Grilled cheese, apple, slices, cold lemonade, and a few paper napkins weighed down by spoons. Monica had packed everything with care, not as a maid fulfilling a duty, but as a woman cautiously accepting an invitation. Lena, thrilled by the novelty of eating outdoors, had run barefoot through the grass before finally settling at the table with her mother and Grace in her baby seat beside them. Richard had arrived last, unsure of how to carry himself. He wasn't used to shared meals anymore, not since Claire, not since everything had broken. But now he sat, quiet and attentive, sipping from his glass occasionally, stealing glances at Grace, who for once seemed content simply watching the leaves sway and her sister figure bounce in and out of focus. It felt fragile, the whole scene, like it could evaporate if someone acknowledged it out loud. And then Lena tipped her cup. The juice spilled fast, too fast for her small hands to stop it. A splash of lemonade ran across the white picnic cloth, soaking into the corner of Monica's paper napkin stack. "Oh no!" Lena cried, jumping back and laughing more than panicking. Monica reached to dab the mess, while Richard instinctively grabbed a plate to shield the edge of Grace's seat. It was nothing, really, a common childhood mishap. But in that messy, unscripted moment, Lena turned to Grace, who blinked at the sudden burst of motion and giggled. "It's okay, Maninha. I'll clean it up." The words slipped out like a feather floating through air, light, casual. "Unguarded." Monica froze, her hand still pressed against the soaked cloth. Richard looked up sharply, his expression caught halfway between confusion and something deeper, something guttural. Lena, unfazed, repeated herself with a grin. "She's my Maninha now," she said, wiping the table with the hem of her dress. "Right, Mama." Monica's lips parted, but nothing came out. The moment felt electric, charged by a single word neither she nor Richard had taught, but that Lena had claimed on her own. Richard stared at Lena for a second longer than necessary, his mind replaying the syllables. Maninha. It didn't sound like a nickname, it sounded like a bond, a declaration, a quiet revolution from the mouth of a 6-year-old who hadn't asked for permission to feel what she felt. His throat tightened. There was no polite way to excuse himself from this moment, no polite way to contain what it stirred. Across from him, Monica had yet to breathe. Her eyes had gone glassy, her hands still. Grace cooed softly in her seat, unaware of the tremor she had just caused in 3 adult hearts. Richard looked at Monica then, not directly, not too long, but long enough to know she had heard it too, felt it just as fiercely. There was no dramatic background music, no swelling declaration, just Lena, cheerful, pure, dabbing lemonade off the table like she'd done it 100 times. And Grace, smiling, as if she understood that something invisible had shifted forever in that second. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It was born of proximity, trust, warmth, and hours spent together on the floor, on the couch, at bedtime. It was real. Monica finally exhaled, setting the napkin down gently, as though trying not to disturb what had been spoken. "That's a big word, Lena," she said quietly, her voice careful, respectful of the gravity beneath the surface. Lena nodded, still completely at ease. "Well, she's my baby sister now. I help you with her, and she smiles when I sing." She looked at Richard then. "And Mr. Richard said I could stay sometimes. So we're kind of like a family, right?" He blinked. Of all the adults who had circled this grief-heavy house, it was Lena who had spoken the clearest truth. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Instead, he reached for the glass she had spilled, refilled it with lemonade, and set it back in front of her gently. "Be careful," he said, not unkindly. "You don't want your Maninha to get sticky." Lena giggled, delighted. Monica turned her face slightly away, but not before Richard noticed her wiping the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. Neither of them commented on it. They didn't need to. Lena had done what neither of them had dared. She had named the connection and given it permission to live. For the rest of the meal, conversation continued in light trickles. Bits of nonsense from Lena, soft comments about the food from Monica, the occasional quiet hum from Grace. Richard remained mostly silent, but not withdrawn. His presence felt fuller now, as though he were finally stepping into the shape this household was becoming. He watched Lena scoop bits of cheese from her plate with exaggerated precision, heard the way Monica reminded her to chew slowly without sounding like she was correcting her. He watched Grace stretch her fingers toward the sunlight with a lazy peace he hadn't known a 3-month-old could embody. And through it all, the word clung to the air, echoing without needing to be repeated. Maninha. It was like a thread tying them together, fragile but real, fragile but holding. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet, but he felt it. And feeling it didn't scare him the way it might have days ago. It grounded him. It anchored him to something living again. As Monica gathered the plates and napkins at the end of the meal, Lena chased a butterfly near the bushes, and Grace began to drift into a nap. Richard rose slowly, glancing once more at the stained tablecloth. The juice spill had dried in the sun, a faint yellow imprint of a moment that would never leave his mind. He didn't try to clean it. Some messes didn't need fixing. Some of them were proof of something new. And as he turned to walk back toward the house, he carried with him not the weight of what had been lost, but the unshakable sound of what had just been found. Maninha. A word that hadn't been taught, a word that hadn't been planned, a word that now lived in all of them. Richard hadn't planned the timing, only the intention. He stood in the hallway just outside the kitchen, rehearsing the opening line in his head for the 3rd time. Each version of it sounded awkward, too formal, too apologetic, too fragile. And yet none of them quite captured what he needed to say. Monica had just finished putting Grace down for a nap when he finally cleared his throat and said, "Do you have a minute?" She looked up from wiping the edge of Lena's juice cup, sensing something different in his voice. There was no command in it, no expectation, just hesitation and something almost vulnerable. She nodded. "Of course." He gestured toward the sitting room, and they walked in together. He didn't sit immediately, pacing once, twice, then finally standing still, hands tucked into his pockets like they might steady his nerves. Monica watched him carefully, heart beginning to erase. She'd felt something shifting these past few days, subtle but real, and now it seemed it had reached a threshold neither of them could avoid. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about everything, about you, about Lena, about this house, and what it's becoming." Monica didn't interrupt. She sat quietly, but her fingers pressed together tightly in her lap, anchoring her to something solid. Richard continued, tripping on the edges of his words. "When Claire died, I thought that was it, that the house would just be a place to survive in, not live. I thought Grace and I would exist beside each other, not with each other, and I thought the best thing I could do was keep everything at a distance, safe, clean, controlled." He stopped then, looked at Monica fully. "But you changed that. You and Lena. You didn't just feed Grace, you gave her back something I didn't even realize she had lost." His voice broke just for a second. "A sense of belonging." Monica felt a sting behind her eyes, but said nothing. Richard's throat tightened. "I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I don't want this house to feel like a museum of what I lost. I want it to be something new, and I want you to be part of that." He paused, then took a breath that felt like it came from someplace deep in his chest. "I want you and Lena to stay, not as employees, not as help, as part of this house, part of this life, part of our family." The words fell into the space between them, trembling with all the weight they carried. Monica didn't move. She didn't blink. For a long, unbearable moment, she just sat there, the silence expanding until Richard wasn't sure if he had gone too far or not far enough. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She lowered her head, and then the tears came, quiet but undeniable. They weren't sobs, not dramatic, but steady, reverent tears, like something sacred had just cracked open. Richard stepped forward instinctively, unsure if he should offer his hand, unsure of what to do with the emotion he'd unearthed. But Monica shook her, Ed softly, not to reject him, but because she couldn't speak yet. Her body trembled with the weight of the moment, years of struggle, isolation, single motherhood, and survival folding into this one offer, a home. Neither of them noticed the tiny pair of feet tiptoeing just outside the room, the slow creak of the hallway door inching open. Lena had been on her way to ask her mother for another storybook when she'd heard the conversation. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, not really. But the words had glued her to the doorway, especially the last part. She pressed her palm against the frame and peeked in, just enough to see her mother crying. Real tears, not the quiet ones she sometimes wiped away in secret. And Mr. Richard was just standing there, not yelling, not mad, but soft, like he was made of something different now. Lena's chest swelled with something she didn't have a word for yet. But she recognized it the same way she recognized the smell of fresh bread or the sound of her mother humming in the kitchen. It was the feeling of being wanted. So, without asking, she ran into the room, skipping past Richard and Monica straight to the nursery where Grace was still asleep. She leaned over the crib rail and wrapped her arms gently around the baby's small blanket-covered body. "She's my sister, Mama," Lena said softly, but clearly, from the other room. "We already live here, in our hearts." Monica's head jerked up, startled, wiping her face quickly as she turned. Richard turned too, eyes blinking fast. Lena stood at the crib like a guard made of hope, one hand resting on Grace's chest. "I don't need to pack again, right?" she asked. "Because I like it here, and Grace likes me." Monica stood slowly, heart still trembling. She walked into the nursery doorway and saw her daughter's face lit with something pure and fearless. "No, baby," she whispered. "You don't need to pack." Lena grinned, and though she didn't fully understand everything that had just changed, she knew something big had happened. Behind her, Richard appeared in the doorway, watching. Them, Monica, Lena, and Grace, as if seeing the picture he didn't know he was missing until now. In the quiet that followed, Monica turned to him, her voice still shaky but clear. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This changes everything." Richard met her eyes and nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I want." They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, they simply stood together, bound by what had just been said and what no longer needed to be explained. And as Lena hummed gently to Grace, rocking the crib with her small hand, the house seemed to exhale around. Them, accepting this new shape, this new rhythm, this unspoken yes that had been waiting in all of them to be said. Richard hadn't meant to open the bottom drawer of the old sideboard. He was looking for a set of coasters Monica had mentioned last week, the nice ones Claire used to bring out when they had guests, but his hand had grazed the edge of something wooden and familiar. He paused, pulled it out. It was a picture frame, older than he remembered, and inside it Claire's face stared back at him, smiling, eyes lit up in a way only new mothers possess. She held Grace in her arms, just days old, still pink and fragile. Richard's breath caught in his chest. It was the photo they'd taken before everything turned. He remembered the way Claire had laughed when Grace sneezed right after the camera clicked. That laugh was still in his ears somehow. He ran a thumb along the edge of the frame, not even realizing how tightly he was gripping it. The past was there, real and close, but it didn't sting the way it used to, not as sharply. He stood still for a moment, just holding it, and then, almost instinctively, looked across the room toward the shelf where other photos lived, some standing, some buried behind books. He knew what he had to do. Later that afternoon, Monica was folding laundry in the sunroom when Richard stepped in and asked, "Do you have that photo, the one Lena took last weekend?" She blinked, surprised by the request. "The one where I'm holding both of them?" she clarified, already knowing the answer. He nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." Monica didn't ask what it was. "For?" She simply wiped her hands on a cloth and retrieved it from her purse. It had been printed at the pharmacy just 2 days earlier. One of those moments Monica didn't expect to mean anything beyond a keepsake. She handed it to him gently, the corners still stiff. In the picture, she sat on the garden bench, Grace resting in one arm, her tiny head curled against Monica's shoulder, while Lena clung to the other side, laughing, mid-sentence, mid-life. Richard took the photo, thanked her, and disappeared into the living room. She didn't follow, but something about the way he walked made her heart thrum. It wasn't businesslike or distracted, it was deliberate. Richard placed the 2 frames side by side on the upright piano. He didn't think too hard about it, didn't weigh the symbolism. He just knew it was time. Claire's photo remained on the left. She deserved that. She always would, but next to her, a new image now lived. Not a replacement, not a revision of the past, but an acknowledgement of what had grown out of its wreckage. He stood back and looked at them both. One photo was love beginning, the other was love becoming. He hadn't touched the piano since the funeral. No one had. Claire used to play it almost every evening, soft melodies while Grace nursed or drifted off. After her death, the keys felt like stones. He couldn't bring himself to sit there, let alone press down. But now, as the late afternoon light stretched across the lid, the 2 photos side by side seemed to breathe together, an invisible thread binding memory and presence. Lena wandered into the room not long after. She was looking for a snack, but stopped when she noticed the 2 frames. "That's Mama Claire?" she asked gently, pointing at the older picture. Richard turned and nodded. "Yes, that was the day Grace came home from the hospital." Lena looked between the 2 photos and smiled. "She looks like Grace. They both have those sleepy eyes." Richard chuckled softly. "Yeah, they do." She stepped closer to the piano, her fingers brushing the side of the bench. "Does it still work?" she asked. Richard hesitated. "I think so. Want to try?" She looked up at him as if seeking permission. He nodded. "Go ahead." Lena sat, small legs dangling off the edge, and pressed one key. It rang out, a little dusty, a little off, but it rang. Then she pressed 2 more, random notes that didn't form. Anything recognizable. But to Richard, it wasn't about melody. He stood still, listening to those 3 uneven notes, eyes closing without him meaning to. Something cracked open inside him. Not pain this time, not grief. Something lighter, something alive. It wasn't the music. It was the sound of someone daring to fill silence with life again. It was the courage to press keys that hadn't been touched in months. And as Lena turned and looked at him, hopeful, waiting to see if she'd done something wrong, he opened his eyes and smiled. Not a half smile, not a polite one, a real one. "Sounds good," he said. "Keep playing." She beamed and turned back to the keys. Monica, who had been passing by in the hallway, paused at the doorway, watching them from a distance, her eyes settling on the 2 photographs. She didn't say anything. She just watched Richard standing beside Lena, and in that brief, unscripted moment, she saw it clearly. This was no longer a house in mourning. It was a home learning how to breathe again. The final note lingered longer than it should have. 3 small, imperfect keys. But for Richard, it was enough. Enough to close his eyes and let it echo, not with sorrow. This time, but with something unfamiliar and deeply welcome. And for the first time since Claire's funeral, the house sang again. Not through perfect melody, but through presence, through a photo beside another, through 3 clumsy notes, through a little girl pressing keys, and a man daring to... Listen. Richard hadn't known the letter existed until that morning. It had been tucked away in the back of Claire's old jewelry box, between velvet-lined drawers, where he rarely ventured. He had opened it looking for a small silver locket she used to wear. Grace had reached for it in one of the old photos, and the image had stayed with him. But what he found instead was a cream-colored envelope, soft at the corners from time. His name was written in Claire's handwriting, gentle, slanted, familiar. It didn't say, "To my husband," or "In case I'm gone." Just Richard. The simplicity made his chest tighten. He sat on the edge of the bed and turned the envelope in his hand several times before opening it. He didn't know what he expected, maybe last words, instructions, or memories wrapped in grief. But what he found was something else. A letter filled not with endings, but with warnings and wishes. "If you're reading this," it began, "then the worst has happened, and I hate knowing what you're feeling. But what I fear more is that you'll stop feeling anything at all. Please don't close your heart, not to Grace, not to the world." He read every line slowly, careful not to miss a single word. Claire's voice echoed in the spaces between the sentences. "You are not meant to go through this alone," she had written. "You will want to disappear, to function, to keep things clean and managed and numb. But Grace will need your softness. Someone else might remind you how to find it again. Let them." He paused there, the paper trembling in his hands. Claire had always seen him too clearly. Even in death, she knew exactly what corners he would retreat to, which walls he would build. "You don't have to prove strength by standing alone," she'd added. "You prove it by choosing to let others in." His throat constricted. He could see how right she had been, how fully he had tried to live inside silence, how long he had kept Grace at arm's length, convincing himself it was grief when it had really been fear. Fear of breaking again, fear of loving again, and yet despite himself, love returned in small footsteps and lullabies and quiet hands that asked for nothing. The letter ended simply, "You don't have to rebuild what we had. Just build something true, something warm. I hope, wherever I am, I get to see it." By the time Richard reached that final line, the tears were falling. Freely. He didn't try to wipe them away. He just sat there, letting them come, letting the truth settle in his chest like a weight he no longer feared to carry. He folded the letter with care, held it against his chest for a moment, and then stood. The air in the room wasn't different, but he was. Something had opened, slowly, painfully, but completely. He walked to the window and looked down toward the back porch. What he saw made his breath catch in the gentlest way. Monica sat on the porch swing, gently rocking Grace in her arms. Lena was at her feet, reading a book out loud in dramatic voices, clearly enjoying the sound of her own storytelling. It wasn't a scene staged for anyone. It was just life, unpolished and real. He watched them for a long time. Monica was humming something under her breath, not loud enough to interrupt Lena's reading, but just enough to soothe the baby. Grace looked up at her with heavy eyes, her hand clutching a bit of Monica's blouse. Lena turned a page with a flourish and laughed at something she'd said. Richard didn't know what the book was, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling in his chest. It wasn't the dull ache that had followed him for months. It was warmth, soft, persistent warmth, the kind that doesn't announce itself but wraps around you until you realize you've stopped shivering. Without thinking too much, he walked outside, letter still folded in his hand. Monica glanced up as he approached, her smile unsure, as if unsure of what part of himself he was bringing today. He didn't speak. Lena continued reading, unfazed. Grace blinked slowly, drifting into sleep. And then gently, Richard sat beside Monica on the swing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air between them had long since been filled with everything words couldn't hold. After a quiet moment, he reached over and took her hand in his. There was no ceremony in it, no announcement, no declaration, just a hand reaching for another. Monica turned her palm upward and let his fingers settle between hers. Her shoulders dropped the slightest bit, as if an invisible weight she hadn't mentioned had just been shared. Lena didn't notice, or maybe she did, and chose to let it be. Grace stirred once, then resettled. The porch creaked softly beneath them. Richard closed his eyes, not to escape, but to be present. In that touch, quiet and steady, a truth was spoken without language. Not a family by blood, not one formed by plan, but one chosen stitch by stitch, breath by breath, silence by silence. Claire had asked him to build something warm, and as he sat beside Monica, his daughter sleeping between them, his heart resting in her palm, Richard knew he had. This story touched us deeply while creating it, and we hope it reached your heart too. Here on our channel, every story is made with care, thinking of you, our community that values kindness, memory, and emotion. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep bringing more heartfelt moments like this to life. Feel free to explore other stories on our channel, and don't be shy. Leave us a comment telling what this one meant to you. We read every word. Thank you for being here, truly. Until next time.